The History Man with Terry Kringle.
Hello. When movement began towards what is more properly known as constitutional reform in the Isle of Man is not known precisely, but it's very likely that it took root when, in 1867, the House of Keys became democratically elected instead of self-elected for the first time. This resulted in Tynwald being given more control of its finances by the Home Office and the Treasury in London, so developing an increasing taste for what was known as Manx Home Rule. But it was to be some time before there was a body acknowledged to be in the forefront of what could be called a campaign. It was not until 1903 that the Manx National Reform League was set up. Its aims were first explained to the public at a packed meeting held in the main hall of Murray's Road School in Douglas. These had been formulated by a group of 6 men, one of whom was Samuel Norris, a future MHK, who was the driving force behind them, and on October 31st, 1903, a public meeting agreed that the Manx National Reform League should be formally launched with an elected committee. Interestingly, this included the editors of the Isle of Man Examiner, the Isle of Man Times and the Manx Sun, representing a commitment to extensive newspaper coverage of the League's activities. The main objectives included the extension of what was labelled Manx Home Rule, so that the Manx people and their elected representatives could regulate their own affairs without undue interference from London. It was at the time commendably ambitious, but the problems were many. In the first place, something had to be done about the upper chamber of Tynwald Court, the Legislative Council. This was where the centre of absolute Crown control over the island existed. All 9 of its members were paid officials appointed by the Crown or the Lord Bishop. They were the Lieutenant Governor, the 2 Deemsters, the Clerk of the Rolls, the Lord Bishop himself, the Vicar General, the Archdeacon, the Receiver General, and the Attorney General. They formed, in effect, the executive government of the Isle of Man, able to pass, reject, amend, or initiate legislation. This placed the democratically elected House of Keys in an inferior and subordinate position when it came to the governance of the island. Democracy it was not. But the Keys and the Manx National Reform League were not going to take it lying down for much longer. There was strong demand in the Keys for drastic reform of the Legislative Council, and in 1903 there was a general election coming up, and the League was announcing its interest. It circulated existing members of the Keys and the new candidates for election stating its reforms, and called for these to be taken into account at public election meetings. This was taking the fight for reform, constitutional reform, to the man and woman in the street, and there it was to stay up until the present day. The reformers had high hopes that in time their demands would be supported and acted upon by MHKs. But there was still opposition by the Legislative Council and others who viewed the reforms with dismay and believed they were a threat to the stability of the island. One of them, I don't know who, put their case strongly in saying the supporters of reform were mushrooms that spring up under our feet, but they will have to remain under our feet. If there was strong feeling about reform, there was also strong feeling about no change. Meanwhile, one of the founders of the Manx National Reform League, Sam Norris, had become MHK for North Douglas, and he kept pressing his fellow MHKs to get on with reform. But it was a slow business. All too often the House sought refuge in referring the matter to committee for consideration, without any action following. Sam, proprietor of the Norris Modern Press in Victoria Street, Douglas, was an early and highly outspoken supporter of the cause. But constitutional reform finally gathered pace in the 20th century. There was a succession of acts which brought about change in the Legislative Council, which makes it a quite different body today.